Hello, Mark here. Before we begin today's episode, I would just like to quickly take the time to ask all of those who are enjoying the series a favour. If the platform you use to listen to Castings for Ancient Greece has a rating or review system, I would be extremely grateful if you would consider leaving the series a quick review. These ratings and reviews go a long way into helping others discover the show, in turn helping it grow. So if you enjoy the series and can spare a few minutes, I would love to read what you have to say about your experiences with the show. Thanks everyone for your support, and let's get to today's episode. One day, after he had grown to maturity, Hypsilus happened to consult the oracle, and on the strength of the answer he received, an answer which cut, as it were, both ways, set to work and made himself master of Corinth. Herodotus. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece, episode 65, Early Corinth. In our narrative, we are now at a point where we have seen the 30 years peace between Athens and Sparta being tested. The peace had only been established around 446 to 445 BC, and temptations to intervene in the affairs of Athens and its allies had already become attractive just 5 years on. This had occurred around the event known as the Samian War, where Samos had requested help from Sparta as well as Persia. We had discussed how this appeared to have been a pivotal moment in diplomatic relations and the stability of the Greek world. There had been two large powers looking on at Athens and their situation. It was possible if Sparta acted, it could have sparked a general war on the Greek mainland, now that the spheres of influence and allies in both had been further defined in the negotiations. Not only this, but Persia had been looking on, appearing to be very interested in Sparta's response due to the possible fallout within Greece. A general Greek war could see Athens' attention and resources diverted from the eastern Aegean, meaning Persia would be in a much stronger position to look at moving back into these areas that were under Athenian influence. However, this situation would not develop. One wonders if Sparta was really in the position to become involved in a general war, given how they were looking to avoid direct engagement with Athens just years earlier. Though perhaps this crisis around Samos presented an opportunity in their eyes. Maybe they saw Athens in a position where they would be too far stretched to put up an effective fight within Greece, while also having to deal with Samos and the threat of Persia. However, even though Thucydides presents Sparta as being interested in intervening on Samos, they would require cooperation from their allies, one in particular, Corinth, since this is where the majority of the ships would come from. Though Corinth would be against sending aid to Samos, where in a speech made to the Athenians a few years later over another developing crisis, they would say they believed a powerful polis had the right to punish its own allies. This would see the real first test of the 30 years peace, and it would come through on the other side still intact. It also shows the growing importance of the polis of Corinth in diplomacy, involving the two spheres. Moving forward, we will find that Corinth will be at the centre of issues developing in the Greek world, in the years leading up to the Peloponnesian War. It is for this reason that I've decided to take a short break in our narrative, so that we can properly become acquainted with this city-state that we have only spoken about in passing so far. For this episode, we'll be giving Corinth much the same treatment we had given to Athens and Sparta early in the series, and like what we saw with our Greek periphery episodes. We'll head back looking at some of the earliest known foundations of the city, while also looking at what existed on the site before the city developed. Then we will turn to looking at what the myths tell us of the early origins of Corinth, and how the ancients understood the city's development. From here, we will then start heading into areas coming out of the Dark Ages that would see a bit more of a detailed history of Corinth's development politically through the ancient Doric clan, the Bacchiadae. After this, we will then close out the episode looking at the period of tyranny in Corinth. So let's first start by looking at where in Greece Corinth was located. We should be aware by now of the Peloponnese, the southern Greek landmass, and central Greece where Attica is located. Well, joining these two sections of the Greek mainland was a narrow strip of land, or isthmus, around 6 kilometres wide. This isthmus would take its name from the largest city that existed on it during the archaic and classical times, the city of Corinth. Corinth would be located at the southeast end of the isthmus, where it opens out into the Peloponnese. To the west would be the Gulf of Corinth that eventually opened out into the Ionian Sea, while to the east was the Saronic Gulf, leading out into the Aegean. This would see Corinth in a prime location to develop as a trading settlement. Like with the rest of the city-states in the Greek world, the polis of Corinth would be a relatively recent development when looking at classical Greece. The developments that would give rise to the political entity of the polis were taking place through the Archaic period. However, there would still be human activity and signs of habitation well before the polis of Corinth would come into being. For this, we can look back to the Neolithic period. It has been a while since we spoke of these early periods of time, so it might be helpful to jog our memory on when the Neolithic was. The Neolithic was part of a period known as the Stone Age, this Stone Age being broken up into three distinct periods. The Palaeolithic, meaning Old Stone Age, being the point of the earliest known use of stone tools, being around 3.3 million years ago, and lasting to around 15,000 BC. The Stone Age then transitions into what we call the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age, lasting from around 15,000 to 7,000 BC, while it then transitions into the Neolithic, New Stone Age, which would last up until around just before 3000 BC. It must be noted that these dates are a very rough guide, and it can dramatically shift depending on the region of the world being referred to, though these dates are a decent guide for what was taking place in Greece. So as you can see, we'll be more focused on the 7000 to 3000 BC period for detectable human activity taking place around the site of Corinth. We have seen in our first episodes that there was evidence of human activity taking place within the Greek mainland, up to a couple of 100,000 years ago. But then it is within the late Paleolithic and Mesolithic where we had seen much more detail around human habitation in some areas emerge, such as the Franchithi cave on the Peloponnese. However, when looking at the site of where Corinth would develop, it wouldn't be until the Neolithic where activity would be detected. It would be around 6500 BC where some of the earliest evidence would be dated to. Much of the work done to identify this early evidence and later finds would be conducted by the American School of Classical Studies during the excavations from 1968 to 1970. Much of the finds relating to the early and middle Neolithic period are in the form of pottery deposits. However, the teams working on these areas around Corinth had found many of the areas where the early deposits had been disturbed by activities conducted by later times, such as the late Neolithic, Bronze Age, Archaic and Classical ages. This had made it difficult to identify for certain a chronology, as evidence from many time periods had been intermixed in these areas. However, a clearer picture would be formed of early and middle Neolithic items once two trenches uncovered undisturbed pottery from the early and middle periods. However, it would be the late Neolithic period that would see far more evidence of human activity uncovered. This would be mainly through the uncovering of pottery dating to this period, this also indicating that the site around Corinth had been recognised for its potential, which would see more and more people settling, then its population growing as the settlement began to develop. However, as the Neolithic was transferring into the Bronze Age, there appears to be a dramatic drop-off of evidence for human activity. This may indicate disturbances in population as groups were moving or forced to move through other events taking place in Greece. We had seen this in general when looking within the Greek mainland just before the Mycenaean period. Indications had shown that Mycenaean culture developed because of these disturbances, caused by populations from the north beginning to filter down into Greece and interacting with the original inhabitants, often referred to by the ancient writers as Pelasgian. It would appear that the Neolithic site around Corinth would become the most important settlement in the region. As by the Bronze Age, it would seem it would be the location that populations would once again settle in and around, once the population disturbances had quietened down. It is also thought that a palace-like settlement similar to what can be found at Mycenae and Tiryns had also begun to develop near where the classical city of Corinth would be located. This thought has been given more support after recent digs arranged by the Greek Ministry of Culture. In these excavations, parts of a Bronze Age settlement were uncovered, 2 metres below the surface. In this level, a number of different items were found, such as figurines of rams, storage vases, engraved decorations, tripod legs, jugs, and many fragments of other vessels. These are indications that craftsmanship and industry were also present, with the discovery of flywheels, obsidian pieces, blades, and grinding tools. Also found nearby is what researchers think may be a wine cellar. What they uncovered was a deep cone-shaped hole in the ground lined with clay tiles, where spiralled levels wrapped around the inside, which would have allowed people to descend and get back out of the cellar. However, more excavations need to be undertaken to confirm if a palace on the same scale as Mycenae had existed, though what is clear is that there was a thriving Bronze Age settlement at Corinth. Though with like the rest of the Greek mainland, it would regress with the collapse of the Bronze Age. This was where massive population shifts were taking place, with it likely the Bronze Age settlement of Corinth was swept up in the turmoil. Corinth being located on the isthmus connecting the landmass of Greece would have been a highway for those fleeing out of Peloponnese. It would appear that this would have had an impact on the site's decline, as nowhere near the same level of evidence can be found of human activity. This would for the most part draw a constant picture of what was also happening in other areas of Greece, as the Bronze Age descended into what is often called the Dark Ages. However, this Dark Age would not last forever, and within a couple of hundred years, increases in populations and settlements begin to be detected all over Greece. The site of Corinth on the isthmus would be one of these places, where the development of settlements as well as growing population would take hold. Again, the position of Corinth would have seen many people over this period travelling through the site. It seems very likely that the benefits, geographical and economic, would have been realised, like the earlier periods in time. This would be where we see what could be the foundations of what would become the classical city of Corinth develop. Though first, I want to now look at the myths that existed around Corinth, looking at its origins and stories tied up to the Bronze Age. Then we will continue on into the Archaic period, where we will see this development of Archaic Corinth with the arrival of the Doric clan known as the Bacchiadae. So now we come to how the ancient Greeks viewed the founding of the polis of Corinth. There are two main lines that have been found in the ancient sources that look to explain how Corinth first came about, and both would give rise to the name of the city, Corinth being one, and its more ancient name, Ephyrae, being the other. Both of these myths are summed up by Pausanias in his work, A Guide to Greece, Volume 1. He begins by telling us that the myth was popular within Corinth itself, but he seems to suggest that this was not a popular view outside the city. He says, "The territory of Corinth is part of the Argive territory, which took its name from Corinthos. I never knew anyone to maintain with such enthusiasm that Corinthos was a son of Zeus, except that most Corinthians say so." So here we see the Corinthians saw their founder being the son of Zeus. However, it appears this tradition does not exist outside of Corinth itself. The legendary figure of Corinthos seems to be attached to other legendary figures found in different tellings of various myths. From being the son of Marathon, connected to the rulers in Sicyon, and even being an ancestor of a couple of the bandits that Theseus slays on his journey to Athens. Though Pausanias continues to tell us about another tale that has been recorded by a poet from the Bacchiadae clan, who we'll be looking at closer when we move on to the Archaic period. He says, Emilios of the Bacchiadae, as they are called, who is supposed to have written the poetry, says in his Corinthian history, if he really did write it, that Ephyrae, daughter of Oceanus, first settled in this country. Here, Ephyrae is one of the thousands of Oceanids, or water nymphs, who are all daughters of the Titan Oceanus. However, we will also see connections through this same story to Marathon and Sicyon, while us also seeing the ancient names of places changing to what would be known in classical times. Supposedly Marathon fled the Peloponnese to escape his father's lawlessness violence, who ruled both Ephyrae and Asopia. He settled on the coast of Attica, which would be known as Marathon Bay. Though after his father died, he returned and divided up the kingdom between his sons. From this point on, we would be told that Ephyrae and Asopia would be known as Corinth and Sicyon. As you can see, these tales are not very clear and chronology of events is non-existent. But as we have spoken about before, the realm of myth doesn't follow the same rules of recorded history. These two tales also point to the divine being responsible for the founding of Corinth. However, there is also another tale that is recorded by Apollodorus. This tale points to the figure of Sisyphus as being the founder of Ephyrae and its first king. Sisyphus would become famous in Greek myth as being one of the few who would suffer for eternity in Hades. He would cheat death twice and threaten the order of the world in connection with the gods, a crime that would not go unpunished. We have seen before, when talking and passing about different points in myths, that when the order between gods and mortals is threatened, the gods take decisive action. When Sisyphus did eventually die, he would be punished in Hades by being tasked with rolling a huge boulder up a steep hill in Tartarus. What would make this task truly punishing was that whenever the boulder would near the top, it would roll away from Sisyphus and back down the hill, with this process being repeated for eternity. We even find the gods involved in founding matters over Corinth and the wider isthmus. Apparently, a disagreement broke out between Poseidon and Helios, the old sun god, over who controlled the isthmus. A mediation would be held to arbitrate the matter, which the result of would see Poseidon taking control of the lowlands of the isthmus by the sea, and Helios controlled the hills and mountains being closer to the sun. This also including the Acropolis Corinth would be built upon. So these are some of the main myths associated with the founding of Corinth, But before we move on, I just want to mention a couple of other myths connected to the city. These relate to the ancient spring that was located on the Acropolis of Corinth, named Perene. This spring would be the gift of the river god Asopus to the king Sisyphus. Aegina, the daughter of Asopus, would be abducted by Zeus, and Sisyphus had witnessed the act. However, he would not reveal the information around the abduction to Asopus. Asopus would then gift or bribe Sisyphus with the spring to reveal the information he had. The spring of Perene was said to have been sacred to the Muses, and was thought to bring inspiration to those who drank from it. As well as this, it was also the favoured watering hole of the winged horse, Pegasus. This connection with the spring and Pegasus would then feature in the hero story of Bellerophon. Bellerophon in Greek myth was one of the great monster hunters, born in Corinth before the time of Heracles. His most famous deed was the slaying of the Chimera, which was a fire-breathing monster made up of different animals, most commonly depicted as a lion with a goat's head protruding from its back and a snake as a tail. This would be one of the toughest tasks he had to face, and would seek the advice of the famous Corinthian seer, Polydius. He told Bellerophon that he would need the winged horse Pegasus to be successful in his task. To get the assistance of Pegasus, he was told he would need to tame him at the spring of Perene, and to achieve this he was advised to sleep in the temple of Athena. Bellerophon would be visited by Athena in his dream, and would wake up with a golden bridle laid beside him. He had been told to slip the bridle on Pegasus as he drank from the spring. He would then set off for the spring on the Acropolis, where he would find Pegasus. He did as instructed, and now tamed the winged horse. This had now allowed him to avoid the many dangers in engaging the Chimera, and would be successful in slaying the beast. Anyway, that gives us an idea of some of the myths that are associated with Corinth, but now I'd like to move on to areas a bit more attested to in the historical record. Though we will still be dealing with an element of tradition, as writing was not widespread by this point. Have you been enjoying the series and thinking of helping support the show in some way? Casting Through Ancient Greece is over on Patreon, where we have been providing supporters with monthly bonus episodes, where we look at past topics in more detail and isolation. So far we have revisited the Bronze Age of Greece, looking at art, trade connections, warfare, and a number of other topics. We then advanced into the Archaic period, where we then spent some time exploring the little-known Lalatine War, the Olympic Games, and emergence of the hoplite and other areas. This then saw us turn to doing a 3-part series on the epic poet Homer, where we also explored the 2 epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that are credited to him. Currently we are exploring the developments of both Sparta and Athens in more detail. We have recently dealt with the origin myths of both Sparta and Athens, as well as looking at some of the early influential figures coming from both cities. Currently, we're exploring the institutions that would develop in both of these cities, with us having focused on the Spartan agoge and helot system, while in Athens we are looking at their political reforms through the restructure of tribes and the political mechanism of the ostracism. If you're interested in gaining access to these bonus episodes, please consider heading over to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page. Not only will you get monthly bonus episodes, but you will receive early access, ad-free episodes, plus video series updates about what's been happening in the series and what is planned. Other options also include access to fully referenced transcripts of the series episodes, where members' questions are answered monthly via video. Alternatively, you can head to the Casting Through Ancient Greece website, where you can find the Patreon link, as well as other ways that help the series grow when clicking on the Support the Series button. Thank you for listening to the series, and I look forward to perhaps seeing you over on Patreon. So, we've looked into the very early history of Corinth, through the Neolithic period, the Bronze Age, and into the collapse, resulting in the so-called Dark Age. We're now going to turn to the period that would come out of the Dark Age and into the Archaic period. As we spoke about, the collapse of the Bronze Age saw the Corinthian isthmus, along with Corinth itself, become a backwater. Though as some level of recovery began to set in, and the settlement of Corinth would develop, a kingship would emerge to govern this growing society. Tradition of this kingship would see it connected to the Heraclidae, like what we saw with Sparta. This would see Corinth also laying claim to a Dorian ancestry. As you may remember, the return of the Heraclidae was a tradition that saw many cities laying claim to being the ancestor of Heracles. Corinth would be one of these cities, and would see the kingship that developed maintaining their traditional connection to Heracles through his descendants that returned to the Peloponnese to reclaim their birthright. There is a king's list of Corinth that has been recorded that extends back to 1073 through to 747 BC. However, with the names and dates stretching this far back, it is hard for us to know for certain how accurate it is and the bloodlines between each successive king. Though, what appears to take place through the kingship period is the emergence of different clans within Corinth that would have stronger connections to the different kings. One of these clans would be the Bacchiadae, who would draw their origins to the king of Bacchus, who ruled Corinth through the late 10th and early 9th centuries. The ancestry of this clan would begin with Bacchus's 7 sons and 3 daughters, which by the mid-8th century would see this clan numbering a couple of hundred male adults. The Bacchiadae would practice a strict form of endogamy, which would see intermarriage only occurring within the clan, seeing that they would retain a distinct extended family structure, also known as an oikos. This wouldn't see brothers and sisters or other close relatives marrying, as the clan line had descended from 7 separate lines coming from Bacchus. Over the generations, this would see successive offspring become more and more distant relatives from the other family lines within the clan. It would seem very likely that other family clans also existed within Corinth, probably drawing connections to other past kings. However, we don't hear much about any of them, since it would be the Bacchiadae that would end up gaining power and driving the first half of the Archaic period. The traditional date of the Bacchiadae coming to control Corinthian politics would be in 747 BC, this being right at the beginning of what is defined as the Archaic period, a rebirth of society and culture within Greece. The first ancient Olympic Games would mark this transition, being only 29 years earlier, in 776 BC. As we said earlier, the Bacchiad clan would number a couple of hundred adult males by this point in time. It was now nearly 150 years since their common ancestor ruled, and 6 more kings had ruled since. Now on the throne was a king Telestes, and he would face an aristocratic revolution that would bring the time of the kings in Corinth to an end. The circumstances behind why this revolution developed is not known, but the Bacchiadae clan would dispense with a kingship, and it appears that they would rule as a collective in a council-like structure. Within this system, it appears they would elect members to take on leading roles for limited periods, such as the head of the council and military leaders. This being a familiar-looking system when looking to the developments in Athens. However, unfortunately, we are lacking detail around how Corinth was governed, and how, as this new era developed, society functioned under the Bacchiadae. Though it appears Corinth would begin to flourish, it would be under the Bacchiadae that we would see a polis system develop, with the settlement of Corinth and its surrounding regions uniting to a single political identity. This period of Bacchiad control would see large-scale construction projects also taking place. Public buildings would now become a feature on and around the Acropolis of Corinth, along with other monuments. It also appears population was booming during this early stage of the Archaic period, or at least overtaking Corinth's ability to keep its population fed. It would be only just after 10 years of the Bacchiadae coming to power in Corinth, where its first colonies would be established. This might also provide a possible clue to why the revolution broke out in Corinth in the first place. These colonies being established so soon after the kingship being dissolved could suggest overpopulation was becoming a problem and affecting other parts of society. These first colonies that the Corinthians would establish would be that of Syracuse, which we spoke about when doing our Greek periphery episodes on Sicily. The other colony that they would set up during this period would be that of Corcyra, on the modern-day island of Corfu, in the Ionian Sea. This colony of Corcyra would become very important in events playing out during the lead-up to the Peloponnesian War, something we'll be looking into in more detail when we pick up the narrative again. As we can see, this period under the Bacchiadae seems to show a period of growth and prosperity. Corinth was united in a larger political entity known as a polis. Large-scale public works were now a feature of the city, while its population was increasing, seeing colonists needing to be sent out, establishing new cities and connections abroad. Corinth was now emerging as one of the most advanced city-states within the Greek mainland, and would boast a population of up around 10,000. However, control over Corinth by the Bacchiadae would not continue on forever. A new phase in Corinthian history would unfold as the 650s began. This would see the rise of the tyrant in Corinth. We have previously looked at the concept of a tyranny in the ancient Greek world when we looked at Athens' development. At this early stage in the development of city-states in Greece, this form of power seems to have developed where a divide was growing between the ruling class and the rest of the people. As we have seen, tyranny did not have the negative connotations as it does today. A tyrant could be as bad as past leaders, or could in fact see an improvement in conditions of the people and society as a whole. This new form of power had started to become a feature of many polis in the mid to late Archaic period, but it would be Corinth where we would first hear of the figure of the tyrant develop on the mainland. The name of the first tyrant to appear on the Greek mainland was that of Cypselus, and for his rise to power we need to once again turn back to Herodotus and delve into the oracles from Delphi, and traditional stories that would develop around his rise to power. So we get to return to our favourite storyteller, though as I've pointed out in the past, this doesn't mean he was a liar. He just reported what he was told and had heard. So, like with any good transition of power, from one regime to another, we would see a prophecy from Delphi involved. So first we need to go back to the point of the Bacchiadae practicing their strict intermarriage practices. Well, there was one example of this not being observed. One of the Bacchiadae had a daughter, Labda, that was lame and no man within the clan was willing to marry her. This would see her marry outside the clan into another family. She would marry Etion, who would trace an ancestry to the Lapithae, a group in Greek mythology whose home was in Thessaly and kindred people with the centaurs, half man, half horse creatures. The story would go that Etion had no heir and at this stage was concerned for his bloodline. He would travel to Delphi to gain guidance on the matter, where he would, according to Herodotus, receive the following: Etion, worthy of honour, no man honours you. Labda is with child, and her child will be a millstone, which will fall upon the rulers and will bring justice for Corinth. Supposedly, this prophecy would make its way back to the ears of the Bacchiadae, who would connect this back to an earlier prophecy which they had not understood the meaning of. It's not clear how far back this original prophecy had been given, but it was now clear to them that both referred to the same event, with the first being reported as, An eagle in the rocks has conceived, and shall bring forth a lion, mighty, ravaging, and will lose the knees of many. Give heed to these things, Corinthians, you will dwell about lovely Perine and the rock-set town of Corinth. Having now connected the two prophecies, the Bacchiadae now realised the child of Labda, who married outside the clan, was going to be a threat to the clan's hold on power in Corinth. They then hatched a plan to travel to the village where Etion and Labada lived and kill the baby as soon as it was born. 10 men from the clan would set out for the village once news of Labada going into labour arrived. Once they entered the house she gave birth in, they asked to see the baby. Labda, we are told, had no understanding of why they had arrived, and assumed them to be honouring her husband. She allowed them to hold the baby, giving the men the opportunity to carry out their plan. It had been decided earlier that the first of them who was able to get hold of the baby would dash it against the ground. However, once the baby was handed over to the first of them, the baby smiled at him, causing him to smile back and unable to carry out the deed. He would then hand the baby to the next man, where the same scenario would play out, this then repeating until all 10 men could not carry out the task. They handed the baby back to its mother and departed the house. However, once outside, they then began blaming one another for failing to carry out the killing, and eventually they decided they would return and all take part. Labda had been near the door and overheard all that was said. She hid her baby in a chest that she deemed an unlikely place that they would search. Then the men returned inside the house. After some time of searching, they were unable to find the baby and finally decided to return to Corinth, reporting they had been successful in their task. This would now see the baby left to grow into adulthood. He had been named Cypselus, after the chest he had been hidden in. We are then told he would consult the oracle of Delphi for a matter that we are not told about, but will receive a prophecy about his rule of Corinth. Fortune is he who steps down into my house. Cypselus, son of Etion, lord of famous Corinth. Fortune he and his sons, but not the sons of his sons. Armed with this, he now set about seizing power in Corinth and sending up one of the first tyrannies within Greek lands. As we have seen before, a tyrant come from the aristocratic class and rule in their own right through popular support. The same seems to be the case with Cypselus, who emerged as one of the first tyrants in Greece. Although we have these stories about him being fated to rule, it appears under the old regime he had held the office of polemarch, being in charge of the military. Supposedly the people of Corinth were not happy with its current rulers, as they fought through wars with Corcyra and Argos. Cypselus would find himself in a prime position to make a move for control in Corinth. It appears he would use the people's dissatisfaction to gain popular support and use his position as head of the military to back his claims. This would see him, in the 650s, eject the ruling Bacchiadae and cement himself as the first tyrant of Corinth. Now, there are conflicting reports of what sort of leader Cypselus would be. However, the historical record does seem to show that this age of the tyrant in Corinth would be one of prosperity for the city. I think with the differing accounts of Cypselus and his son's rule, we are hearing echoes from different elements of society that felt the effects of this rule. I think as we outline the different takes on his rule, you should be able to guess what part of society was aligned with which opinion. The main negative account of Cypselus is found in Herodotus' histories, where he says, "Many of the Corinthians he drove into exile, many he deprived of their property, and still more, by a long way, of their lives." Given his rise to power and the overthrowing of the Palaeolithic, it seems he was referring to the old gatekeepers of power, and them suffering under his rule. Continuing on, Herodotus would refer to Cypselus' son, starting off less violent than his father, but then overtaking him in bloody mindlessness and savagery. However, Herodotus' account does give a hint that not all was bad with Cypselus, as one of the lines of prophecy that would be given talk of him bringing justice to the city. However, through Aristotle and some other sources, we would hear he was not the despotic ruler that he comes across in Herodotus' account. We would find that he put better trade practices in place, with cities on Sicily and Italy, this helping lead to Corinth's growth in wealth. He is also portrayed as a popular ruler and would not need a personal bodyguard to protect him, while unlike a number of other later tyrants, he would die a natural death. So it would seem that the views of Cypselus' life would depend on who was being asked, the old nobles from the Palaeolithic or the people of Corinth. This view would continue with the rise in power of Cypselus' son, Periander, who would inherit the tyranny. So as I brought up, Herodotus would tell us that Periander started his rule in a less violent manner than his father. However, this would not last, and he would soon surpass his father in cruelty. Herodotus would tell us a story where he would take the advice of another tyrant, that of Thrasybulus, that would lead to this behaviour. I think it is worth relaying this passage from the histories, as I think we have come to enjoy the stories Herodotus relays. He would write, "He had sent a herald to Thrasybulus and inquired in what way he would best and most safely govern his city. Thrasybulus led the man who had come from Periander outside the city, and entered into a sown field. As he walked through the corn, continually asking why the messenger had come to him from Corinth, he kept cutting off all the tallest ears of corn which he could see, and then throwing them away, until he had destroyed the best and richest part of the crop. Then, after passing through the place and speaking no word of counsel, he sent the herald away. When the herald returned to Corinth, Periander desired to hear what counsel he brought, but the man said that Thrasybulus had given him none. The herald addressed that it was a strange man to whom he had been sent, a madman and destroyer of his own possessions, telling Periander what he had seen Thrasybulus do. Periander, however, understood what had been done, and perceived that Thrasybulus had counselled him to slay those of his townsmen who were outstanding in influence or ability. With that, he began to deal with his citizens in an evil manner. Whatever act of slaughter or banishment Cypselus had left undone, that Periander brought to accomplishment. However, like with Cypselus, Periander was also seen in contrasting accounts. He has also been labelled one of the 7 sages of Greece, a collection of statesmen, philosophers and lawgivers renowned for their wisdom. He would be seen as a fair and just ruler, looking out for the intentions of the people and seeing wealth distributed evenly. Perhaps here we can see the group within society that would not have liked this policy and became his enemies. Periander's rule would mark a point in Corinth's golden age, with wealth generated through trade at its highest yet. He would also attempt to further strengthen trade networks by attempting to have a canal dug through the isthmus of Corinth. This would not succeed, but he would have put in place a transport system known as the doylocks. This was a paved track that stretched the width of the isthmus and facilitated the transportation of ships overland. This would see that instead of making the dangerous trip around the Peloponnese, ships could now be hauled overland 6 kilometres. One can imagine that Corinth would have generated a great deal of wealth from this as well, with this severely cutting down the sailing times of trade ships. From this wealth that Corinth would generate, Periander would also engage in beautifying the city with public buildings and would promote the arts within the city, seeing Corinth reach its cultural maturity. Though in the 3rd generation of the tyranny, Periander's nephew would inherit the tyranny. However, it would seem that the enemies of the family would now be in a position to strike at the regime. In 581 BC, an assassination would bring Corinth's tyranny to an end, and see power transfer back to the aristocratic families of the city. So, there we have our first part to our look at the development of Corinth. This saw us begin with the prehistoric periods of the city, all the way through to the development of tyranny in the city. On the timeline, this brings us to around 580 BC in the Archaic period. Next episode, we'll continue our look at Corinth, where we'll follow its development through the Archaic period. This will bring us up to the Greek and Persian War period, where we have much to look into. You might remember back to the episodes around these wars, we saw the sources were not very favourable to Corinth, even though they were fighting on the side of Athens and Sparta. We will look into a number of these instances. However, an understanding of the times Herodotus, our main source in these events, was writing in will help us perhaps see why Corinth is represented the way they are. After this, we will then focus on Corinth as much as we can, through the interwar periods up to where we left matters at the end of the Samian War with Athens. This will then see us in a good position to continue the narrative with us seeing the interactions between Corinth, Athens, Sparta, and their colonies on the path to the Peloponnesian War. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution has truly helped me grow the series. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the support the series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time, where we continue the narrative in the series with episode 66, Corinth, Emergence on the Greek Stage.